Hello, friends. I hope you can hear us all right. We're going to make sure we've got all of our tech looking good. It looks good for me. I hope everybody can hear us okay. Let us know if you can't. But I'm always going to, I think this is just like the way my brain works. I will assume things have gone wrong unless I am told they look okay. So let us know. Um, Hello, welcome to TMC Bible Study Live. We are excited to be here with you tonight. Why don't we go ahead and introduce ourselves? Micah, I'm going to throw it over to you to introduce yourself first.
Hello, everyone. My name is Micah Melody. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the program coordinator at TMC. Peter, would you like to take it next?
Sure, I'm Peter, pronouns they, them, and I am the development coordinator at TMC.
And I'm Austin, and my pronouns are he, him, and I'm the executive director here at TMC. So we are the TMC team, the team of staff. We have a much larger team of friends and volunteers that help us make this whole thing happen, and we're very excited to be with you all tonight. So, hello, Taryn. I see you in the chat already. Good to see you. If you're here and you want to say hi, sound off in the chat and go for that. We'll be interacting with chat as we go tonight and talking with each other. Um, we picked a Bible study story this month that is a little bit spooky. And so we're excited to get into that spooky story for October. But before we do that, I've got a couple announcements. The first is that TMC has a new group for non-binary folks that is just starting. We had our first group yesterday, and so it's once a month. And so if you want to sign up for the TMC non-binary group, I'm going to put the link in chat in just a second. But that group is just starting, and so we wanted to make sure that everybody knew about it. So check that out if you want to. I just put that in chat. And then our second announcement is that next Wednesday, a week from tonight, we have a really awesome workshop that is going to be happening called The Liberative Responsibility of the LGBTQ plus community. And we are having a really awesome pastor named Cameron come talk to us about what it's like to lead a very queer church and like how we as queer and trans folks can support folks with many different intersecting marginalized identities. And so that's going to be next Wednesday. So if you're interested in that, I'm putting the link in the chat for that as well. And the nice thing about TMC workshops, other than that they're awesome, is that they're always pay as you can. So if you're like, I can pay $1 for this, go for it. And if you're like, I can't pay anything for this, I literally have no money this month, just email us and we'll figure out a way to make it work. So go check those things out. I think those are all the announcements. And now we can get into our spooky story. This month, we are talking about a story that has often been labeled, a story that's often been labeled the story of Saul and the Witch of Endor. And we're going to talk a little bit about why we have witch in quotation marks, and like why that particular word and why we use it. But if you want to read along with us tonight, that story can be found in 1 Samuel chapter 28. And we're going to be reading most of the chapter. It's 1 Samuel 28, 3 through 25. So we're going to be reading it in chunks. We're not going to try to like read the whole thing and then talk about the whole thing. We'll like take it in little pieces. So don't be overwhelmed. It's going to be fine. We'll walk you through it. And that's the plan. So I'm trying to think, is there anything else I'm missing you all about prefacing our story here before we get into it?
I think we're good to go.
All right, cool. As always, if you're reading in a specific translation, let us know in the chat if you have words that are different, because those are always fun. And especially in this story, there are like several words that people have translated very differently because it's a complex story. So let us know if you see some of those. Why don't we start out by reading the first chunk of our story tonight, which is verses 3 through 6. And that gives us kind of the background of what's going on here. Micah, you want to read the first few verses here, 3 through 6?
Yes, give me one moment to grab the. All right, so I am reading out of the New Revised Standard Version. And again, like last month, this is still the old New Revised Standard Version. So verses 3 through 6. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. Saul had expelled the mediums and the wizards from the land. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shaunem. Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. When Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, not by dreams or by Urim or by prophets.
Yeah. So if you're thinking, wow, that was a lot of names and places, and who the heck are all these people? You are not alone. This is the background to our story. And to give you a little bit of a sense of where things are, Samuel, First Samuel and Second Samuel are the stories of the early stories of the first kings of Israel. And the first king of Israel was named Saul. And Saul's whole thing was that he was chosen by God to be the first king, but then he screws up a couple of times, and God is like, actually, you shouldn't be the king anymore. And we can get into why that is. But so Saul is at this point at the end of his reign, and this is actually some spoilers about what's going to happen to Saul later on. But this is the end of Saul's reign that happens in this story. So we know who Saul is now. Who's Samuel? Anybody want to, Micah or Peter, you want to give any background on who Samuel is? I can do it if you don't want to, but I always want to give you a chance.
I can, unless you want to, Peter.
Go for it.
All right. So Samuel is one of the prophets around this time. And in some other stories, some other context with Samuel, Samuel is the prophet that anoints. This whole thing is anoints. I believe Samuel was the one that anointed Saul initially, and then eventually the Saul comes to the end of his reign, and Samuel's also the one that anoints David, who is the one who replaces Saul. So this is, and Samuel also have a ton of other stories. Samuel's a fascinating character, but particularly for this story, I think that's one of the relevant contexts. Is Samuel is a prophet that has anointed the kings and has been given, it is a kind of a go-between between God and the kings.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, exactly. It's like Samuel is the kingmaker, very much so, like taking things from what God says and then deciding who's going to lead Israel. So Samuel has just died, and Saul has just expelled all the mediums and wizards from the land. And then there's this huge army of the Philistines, who are rival people to the Israelites. And the Philistines have a giant army, and Saul is supposed to fight them. And so Saul gathers everybody, and Saul sees this huge army of the Philistines, and he kind of freaks out. And so he says, I'm going to go try to figure out what God wants, because Samuel's not here to tell me what God wants anymore, which is like a first for Saul. Samuel's been there this whole time to tell him what God wants, and now he doesn't have Samuel anymore. So Saul does a couple things. He inquires of the Lord, but the Lord doesn't answer him, not by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. So theoretically here, dreams, like maybe God would speak to you in a dream, and then through other prophets, maybe if there was another prophet that was supposed to have come after Samuel, which eventually there are. But the one that you might be like, what is that? Is Urim, Urim. So what does it mean to inquire by Urim? So this is an interesting Old Testament or Hebrew Bible sort of thing that we don't talk about very much, which was that there was a way that priests in the temple would inquire of God. Usually we think it was a yes or no question, and they would use these things called the Urim and the Thummim to tell people what God's answer to them was. So I'm going to read the little description here. This is from the Oxford Companion to the Bible. They have an article on the Urim and the Thummim, and it says, the meaning of these words is not certain. Both are plural in form, but they seem to refer to single objects that functioned as sacred lots and may have been the form of dice, pebbles, or sticks. Another possibility is that they were two stones, one white and the other black. We may conclude that these sacred lots provided a yes or no answer. And then it says Saul's inquiry of the Lord in 1 Samuel 28 shows that a positive or negative answer was not guaranteed, and it may mean that the procedure was not as simple as our heads or tails method. So you'd go to the priest and you'd say, okay, what does God want me to do? Does God want me to do X or Y or Z, and then you would ask the priest to consult the Urim and the Thummim, and you'd be able to tell what God wanted you to do. So this is one of the things that Saul has been consulting to try to figure out, what does God want me to do about this giant battle and about my leadership and everything else. So all those things are ways that Saul was kind of trying to consult God for answers. So as we're reading this story, I wonder what ways we consult God for answers, because it's not like we can't go to a temple and be like, I'm going to ask God a yes or no question. We don't have that particular way of interacting with God anymore. But there might be other ways that we interact with God, and maybe looking to prophets and looking to dreams might be similar. So I don't know, Peter and Micah, what do you think about how we ask questions of God?
Well, I definitely related to Saul's kind of the desperation that comes across in this story, in terms of like when you feel like you don't have clarity about God's will in your life, um, and you just kind of start just throwing everything you can at the wall, or desperately searching around and trying to find some source that seems clear. I think you can, I've had that experience before. You want God to like be really unambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
Like just tell me what to do. Somehow just tell me what to do. That just seemed very relatable to me.
Totally. It reminds me of like, maybe this is a thing all kids do, but I remember as a kid being like, God, if you really exist, like knock over that book or like do something that will show me that you really exist, right? And that's kind of a little bit what's going on here.
Yeah, I feel like we have a version of that as adults too, where it's like, if you pray, maybe if we just pray in the right way, or, like uh, orient your mind correctly to like allow God to speak into your life,
Mm. Yeah.
which often has more to do with like us wanting to control things, I feel like, than actually listening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a percept or a interpretation of this story, that Saul cannot let go of control and needs to know like what to do so that he can be in control continuously. So that's definitely part of it. What do you think, Micah?
Yeah, thinking about this is really interesting because I actually have a friend who has been using tarot cards, and as a way of like, in a very similar way of allowing God to speak through that kind of whatever comes up, and then being like, okay, God, what do you mean by this? That's an interesting like thing that immediately comes to mind for me. But for me personally, I think I a lot of times it's through like intuition, like asking God for guidance, and then sensing either an intuition or I come from a charismatic and Pentecostal background, and so there is a little bit too of like asking God to hear from God on behalf of other people or in community, and doing prophetic prayer in praying in community and listening to God in community, and then testing that against basically what we know about God's character, and so a lot of different things. But it is an interesting thing of like, when I think about the ways, like the idea of casting lots, or the Urim, and just like these different ways of, it's like people have been trying to hear and understand God for like probably from the beginning, and so it's just this like gives me comfort that I'm not alone in my inability to just straight hear like sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think yeah, it's really interesting, and I love that this is included in these stories, and I wish that it was talked about a little bit more.
Totally. Yeah. We often think about like, because of the way Christianity has kind of said, like, there's this sense that like Christianity is against any sort of thing like this, I guess, or like any sort of trying to like anything that seems like it might be close to like trying to tell the future or commune with spirits or something. Like there's this sense that Christianity is against all that always forever. And then you read back into like the history of like the Hebrew people, and like even in the New Testament, people are casting lots for things all the time. Like casting lots happens all over the Bible, and that is a way of trying to understand what's going on in the world and believing that God is is acting in that moment is something that we see throughout Scripture. So it's actually not as antithetical as some folks might think. I see what Taryn says here. Very relatable, Peter, the shifting from one thing to the next when each one doesn't feel clear, but not stopping and sitting with the answers we get. Oof. Okay. So Taryn, you just hit on something important for this story, which is God has been telling Saul previous to this story over and over again that he's done being king, that Saul, you're not supposed to be in charge anymore. And David is actually supposed to be in charge now. And Saul is not stopping to listen to that. So you actually got to a very important thing in this story, is that Saul isn't stopping and listening. Saul is like, well, I'm just going to try to find another message about what needs to happen. So yeah, that's all some really good background to have as we think about this. Another piece of good background comes in as we think about this sort of the casting lots and trying to figure out what God wants, and like how the line between religion and other things that people might quantify as like magic or witchcraft, that line is real murky in this story. And we can talk more about like why we classify things the way that we classify them. So in earlier in the Bible, in Deuteronomy, which is where you find like a lot of the story of Israel, but also a lot of stories about how Israel is supposed to be. There's a passage where it talks about people who consult oracles or consult spirits, and how that's not supposed to be a thing that Israelites are supposed to do. So in Deuteronomy 18, it says, when you come into the land the Lord your God is giving you, you must not learn to imitate the abhorrent practices of those nations. No one shall be found among you who makes a son or daughter pass through the fire, or who practices divination, or is a soothsayer, or an augur, or a sorcerer, or one who casts spells, or who consults ghosts or spirits, or who seeks oracles for the dead. So you've got this list of things that you're not supposed to do. And given that, it's interesting what Saul does next. So just to read really quickly one verse here in verse 7 of 1 Samuel 28, it says, Saul said to his servants, seek out for me a woman who is a medium, so that I might go and inquire of her. His servants said to him, there is a medium at Endor. So we are introduced to the woman of Endor. And depending on what translation you're reading, you might have her described as several different things. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first, let's talk about this sort of like line between religion and magic and what that looks like. What is magic? How did people in the Bible define it? And so one of the sort of encapsulations of this idea, I think, for me, is there's a quote I have here from Esther J. Hamori. She wrote an article called Women's Divination in Biblical Literature. And she said, religion is what we do, magic is what they do. And so this sense of like, we have the real thing, and anybody who's not doing what we do is just like they're doing magic that isn't real, right? And so this division between us and them and religion and magic seems like it might be relevant as we're talking about the people of Israel here, especially considering that bit in Deuteronomy that was basically like, you're coming into a new land with strange people that do different things from you. Don't be like them. So there seems to be a separation there. What do y'all think, Peter and Micah?
I love that quote. I'm just like sitting here with that. Religion is what we do, magic is what they do. And it immediately brings to mind like the Salem witch trials. The idea and the connection to the ways that the idea that like the Salem witch trials, a lot of it comes down to women were becoming empowered in ways that people were uncomfortable with. And so when it's so easy to say we have the truth, and utilizing magic in almost magic today, there are, different people who practice different forms of magic, or Wicca, witchcraft, etc. But thinking about the ways that often, especially in the historical church, magic has been used, the language of magic has been used to demonize or other. And so I love the way that this kind of calls that out and really makes that apparent, because it really is, I think, so easy to like label something as magic or demonic or various different things, and then we don't have to engage with it seriously because it's just not true or it's not right. Or so I love that it, you know, it really raises that point and makes me think about like, okay, what are the words that we're using and how are we using them, like either intentionally or unintentionally. What does othering, what happens, you know? So I think that's what immediately comes to mind for me.
Language and the way we use that to other and say this is legitimate and that's not legitimate. What do you think, Peter?
Yeah, I totally agree. I was seeing similar things in some of the reading I was doing about this passage too, just and thinking, yeah, about all the ways that like different forms of spirituality or different ways of relating to the divine have been controlled by people in power or categorized by people in power. This is a legitimate way of doing that, this is sanctioned, this is approved, this isn't. And then also how that has often been gendered too. I was reading another source that was talking about the fact that women are often associated with witchcraft, and that's I was reading from a couple of Jewish scholars who were talking about the history of that connection through the history of the Jewish people, and we're saying this quote said, if our Simeon Bar Yochai carried out actions beyond the realm of the laws of nature, that was a miracle. But if a woman carried out the same action, that was witchcraft. And so talking about how, again, this sort of like hierarchy of ways of relating to the divine, and if it's a way that's been associated with women, then it's less legitimate.
Totally. Yeah, there's a lot going on here with like the aspects of gender and power, especially in this story.
Yeah, and then too, just historically, the understanding of, like you said, the connection to the divine versus connection to other powers, the ways that gender and masculinity in particular is often connected to the divine, where femininity is often connected to like the earth or to like the physicality of being. And so ways in which that those dynamics have played out throughout history is, yeah, you have this hierarchy of power, and that's really fascinating. But doesn't surprise me that kind of if there was a kind of a miracle that happens and it was a male spiritual leader performing it, it's a miracle. But if a woman does it, it's witchcraft. And that seems, I mean, it makes sense and it lines up.
Yeah. There are lots of really interesting stories, especially among the prophets, of like things happen. Like I can't remember if it was Elijah or Elisha, but there at one point he proves something by making an axe head float on water, and you're like, how is that not magic? Like, why is that specifically a religious thing and not a magic thing? I'm seeing some stuff in the chat here. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, some great stuff in the chat. So first of all, I noticed that I'm not sure who is it, Kef Consol says, have you seen the show Kings? And I have not.
Me neither.
Does anyone? Yeah.
No,
Would you do you like want to post a little bit more about in the chat about what that is? And I'm really curious about what that is and the connection here. And then I see Amory says, interestingly, the root word used to describe the three magi who visited the Christ child at his birth has the same root as magic, which is also, yes, and the ways that they are like they come in honor. I love that. And
yeah,
the ways
magi,
that
like translating that as magician is like spot on, and we just don't do that
yeah,
because we feel uncomfortable about it.
Yeah. And then Taryn says, reminds me of the satanic panic where nearly anything not understood was labeled as evil. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk about this woman at Endor and how we talk about her. Seek out for this a woman who is a medium, and what we call her and why we call her that. So depending on the translation, and you let us know in the chat if you see any translation differences in whatever version you're reading. I looked and I went through a whole bunch of different translations and just took out a bunch of ways that she's described. So she's described variously as a witch, a medium, a religious professional, a ghost wife, a woman with a divining spirit, a necromancer, a woman who can talk to spirits, and a woman who has a pit, which it seems like it's an odd one out, but it's actually not that weird, because the root Hebrew word there is ob, and there are some scholars that think that there's a connection there to the Hebrew, or to the, actually maybe it was previous to that, Akkadian, but to the word for pit. And the idea is like that. Like if you read a Bible translation that talks about people going down to the pit, it essentially just means like where you go after you die. And it's not really, it's not like hell. It's a different understanding of the afterlife. So that's another way that she has been described, as a woman who has a pit. So all of these different ways are ways that this woman has been described. If you're going to try to do some literal translation of this woman, it's probably most closely described as a woman who has a ghost, or a woman who has a spirit. And so that's kind of one of the ways that we could talk about this woman and who she is and what she does. Um, so yeah, I wonder if anybody has any thoughts about why we call the woman what we call her, or what we should call her. Like, do you like any specific description better than another one?
Well, I just want to note something that I noticed, and we haven't gotten there yet because we haven't gone, verses 7 through 14. But the interesting thing is, it's Saul is the one that labels her this way. But for the rest of the passage, she's just referred to as a woman or the woman, which is fascinating. So it's like the label is being put on her. And so I think regardless of whether, what we choose, like I think we need to have a recognition that we are still choosing what to call her. There is still a choice in the words that we call her, just like as Saul says, find me a woman who has a ghost, or find me a medium, so that was just something that stuck out to me.
Totally. Because like we don't get her name. Like, what if we just had her name? Imagine how different the story would be.
Yes, Taryn, exactly. I wonder what she called herself. Like, how would she even refer to herself? What were the labels that she would use, or the identities that she would hold?
I think it's important too, the difference between the translations that talk about who she is, like saying she's a witch, or I'm trying to think of like one of the other examples here, a necromancer, right? Versus the ones that say what she does, like a woman with a spirit, or a woman who consults spirits. Like there's a difference between a word that describes a person's identity versus a thing that describes what they do, which I think is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and like usual, like we have all of these associations with these different terms too that come from our context, so it's just, if we say witch, it means certain things. Which is why we chose this passage, just kind of a little tongue-in-cheek for October. But you think about all of the things that means to us now, and the sort of meaning it is accrued over millennia.
Yep.
But then I was interested by the one you said, religious professional, like the fact that
yeah, so
you know what I mean, like she's someone who has like abilities or authority in terms of like her, like being able to connect people to the divine. And just thinking about the fact that women were usually excluded from like formal positions within the religious establishment. So like in what way is she kind of claiming a role that is denied to her by people in power?
Totally. Yeah, I want to go deeper into that, because that's a huge thing that we have to talk about in this passage. Is like, is this woman somebody, is this woman sort of just like the weird old lady that lives outside of town, or is this a woman who like has legitimate like spiritual connection, but it's not sanctioned by the people in power, and like she's good at her job and what she does, but she's not allowed to do what she does because of her gender. So let's read the next chunk here, and we'll talk more about it. I saw Miss Erilyn says Saul was told to wait for instruction, and in his impatience failed to do so. Yeah, so the Saul just kind of going back to the earlier section, Saul is just sort of freaked out and doesn't know what to do and says, I'm going to figure out myself what to do by asking somebody. Yeah. So the next section here, the next chunk of this story is verses 7 through 14. I read verse 7 already, but we can read that again. So 7 through 14. Peter, you want to do that?
Sure. I am also reading from the New Revised Standard Version, but the updated edition.
The new.
Yes. We're doing, you said 7 through 14?
14. Yep.
Then Saul said to his servants, seek out for me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go to her and inquire of her. His servants said to him, there is a medium at Endor. So Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes and went there, he and 2 men with him. They came to the woman by night, and he said, consult a spirit for me and bring up for me the one whom I name to you. The woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the wizards from the land. Why then are you laying a snare for my life to bring about my death? But Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? He answered, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The king said to her, have no fear. What do you see? The woman said to Saul, I see a divine being coming up out of the ground. He said to her, what is his appearance? She said, an old man is coming up. He is wrapped in a robe. So Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did obeisance.
Oh, so good. Saul showing up and being like, get me a ghost. And the woman's like, I'm not supposed to do that. Are you sure? And Saul's like, it'll be fine. And then she does it and everybody freaks out. Such a good.
Kind of makes me wonder like what they were expecting. Like, like, is this expected to happen? Because the fact that everyone's freaking out, like, I think the women probably expected this, this to kind of go down, but like, she doesn't expect who's going to come from the ground.
Mhm.
And yeah. So it's just interesting because there's a lot of chaos in this scene.
Yeah, and in the NRSV, which is what I'm reading too, the bit where it says she cried out in a loud voice is so toned down. Like in Hebrew, it's basically like she screamed loud. And she cried out in a loud voice seems so like chill. Like,
is there an implication that she was somehow surprised by what she saw do, or like what is she reacting to there?
I think scholars kind of go back and forth on that. They're like, maybe she was like, some people who don't believe that there are some people that are like, she didn't have any power and God just wanted to do this. So she was as surprised that it happened as anybody. I think that's discounting this woman who I think knew what she was doing. So other folks who think that she did do this on purpose, she screamed because she recognized Samuel and then knew that he must have come for Saul. And so like knowing that only Saul could have called for Samuel and he would have shown up, she was freaked out by the fact that she had the king in her house and the king had just gotten rid of everybody who was doing what she's doing.
Which does seem to follow with the next thing she says. Why have you deceived me? You are Saul.
Yep. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think that makes most sense in the context of what comes later in the way that she starts speaking to Saul, because she's not like, oh my God, this actually worked. She's like, wait, I know who you are. Like, why are you deceiving me? So like, I think the surprise on her end, the way I'm at least interpreting this and reading this is coming from the hiddenness of what's happening and the deception, rather than the fact that it's happening, so.
Right, because Saul dressed up and went by night and wanted nobody to know he was there. Yeah, totally. An interesting thing about that the very last verse we just read there, an old man is coming up and he's wrapped in a robe. So Saul knew that it was Samuel. Samuel is associated with a very specific kind of robe his whole life. His mother makes him robes as a child. When he's a child in the temple, she brings him a new robe every year. There are like several points where robes are really important. At one point, when Samuel tells Saul that he's no longer supposed to be king, he rips a robe to try to like symbolize that. So there's like lots of robe symbolism that happens with Samuel. So it's imagining like this ghost of Samuel that shows up has a very specific kind of robe, and that's how people recognize him, which I think is kind of interesting.
Samuel's signature look.
Yes, exactly. Samuel, the guy who just wore one robe all the time. Yeah. I see Taryn says, it makes me wonder who might have been going to show up if Saul had wanted. I'm wondering if there's half a sentence there, Taryn. If Saul had wanted what? Tell me more about what you're thinking there. I'm interested.
I think it might be weighted actually, in the context of what Miss Ehrlin said. Like,
yeah, good point. Right, like what would have happened if Saul had just waited, or if Saul, what would have happened? A whole alternate history there. And Taryn also says particular robes to identify reminds me of kids' Bibles where each character had a singular look even as they aged. Yeah, it's true. It's like cartoons where the person's always dressed the same throughout their entire life. Totally. Samuel had a bit of that going on. Oops, I got lost in my notes here. We talked a little bit about witchcraft and who this woman is and the ideas of why we associate things with certain people. What the interactions between Saul and the woman, what are we looking at when we look at the power dynamics at play? Because there's a lot going on with how these two people speak to each other, how Saul speaks to the woman and how the woman speaks to Saul in the midst of this summoning. So Micah, did you have something you want to share about that?
Yeah, I just find it really fascinating. Well, maybe fascinating is the wrong word, because I found it also kind of heartbreaking the way that it almost feels like the woman is compelled to follow, especially after Saul is revealed. So like if we look beforehand, and the woman is saying like, I don't want to do this because like the king has made this illegal. And then Saul, who's disguised at that point, is like, no, don't worry about it. We're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. And I swear by God, like invoking God's name as a way to coerce. And like, so there's that happening. And then she agrees. And then when she's like, wait, why did you deceive me? You're Saul. He then essentially says like, well, don't worry, and let's keep going. And so I wonder how much the power dynamics are both gendered, because there is the dynamic of the power dynamic of gender here, but also too, invoking God's name in order to coerce is another power dynamic at play. And then three, like lastly, being just the nature of the king in this woman's house is another major power dynamic. So I wonder how much agency, if we think about this, one of the articles I was reading kind of put this in context of the Me Too movement and the idea of coercion. And let's see, let me see if I can read it. This is Rachel Stark writes, in this Me Too era, it's hard not to read the women's words in this story and hear them as echoes of so many women as they wrestle with the guilt of being in the wrong place at the wrong time with a powerful man. And so I just think about the ways that, how do we see the dynamics of gender and coercion and multiple levels of power and lack of agency in this story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because even before she knew it was Saul the king, she knew this is a guy that showed up at my house with servants and or bodyguards. So yeah, that's a lot. And so some people read her sort of like, I can't do this, the king said not to, as sort of like almost a sort of I don't know, like saying what she knew she was supposed to say, even though she was going to do it anyway. But other people read it as like honest, like, hey, I'm not supposed to do this and you're going to get me in trouble and I don't want to do this.
Yeah. And in the modern context, how many women who, or other, and not just women, it's people who don't have full agency to say, no in a situation. How many of them are disregarded when they say, I didn't want to do this? And then people were like, well, really? Like, you should have dressed differently, or you should have done, and it becomes about that person and why didn't you say no? And why didn't you stop this? Well, the power dynamics here are at play. So yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. And there's an interesting moment that we're coming up to where the power dynamic shifts in a strange way. So we're going to come up to that in a second here. But the other thing that you had kind of pointed out was in verse 13, where it says, where Saul says, "What do you see?" And the woman says to Saul, "I see a divine being coming up from the ground," before she describes who it is. There's an interesting moment there where when it comes to the word that she uses to describe this person she's seeing come up. So Micah, what did you find out there?
So this is one of my favorite things about this story. And when we first picked this story, I completely forgot that this was here. But when it says divine being, the Hebrew for that is Elohim, which, if you're familiar with the word Elohim, Elohim is the name for God in the Hebrew Bible, and it is often used to refer to God, like the God of gods, like the Yahweh. And so the fascinating thing is, Samuel's spirit, the divine being that comes out of the ground, is referred to as a Elohim. There's no definitive article attached to it, so it's just an Elohim. So the interesting thing is, we haven't got there quite yet, but the same word in Hebrew is again used in verse 15, and we'll get there in a bit. But that in that context, it's actually referring to Yahweh. It's referring to God. And so it's really interesting to think about the ways that language is used, just in surprising ways. When I first discovered this, I was like, wait, what does that mean about, like, what is God? Is it like a class of, like, is Elohim a class of divine beings? Like, how do we understand this? And so I'm like curious. One of the things I've been thinking about is, what is the use of Elohim reveal to way? I think you mentioned it, Peter, about the ways we make assumptions about, like, prior context, and read our own context back in. Like, first of all, had you heard of this before, or when you encountered this, like, what were your thoughts? And then two, like, how does this, like, make us reflect on the ways that we kind of read our own understandings of spirituality back onto the people of this time?
Yeah, because if you were reading this story and you didn't have the context that Elohim is one of the names for God, you would be like, well, she's seen an Elohim, whatever that is. Like, you might not have all the baggage associated with that word. Yeah, and the interesting thing about Elohim is that it's a plural word. The im ending is a plural word. So that's one of the reasons why, when it's applied to the one God of Israel, it's a strange thing that it's a singular, even though the word itself is plural. So there's an interesting thing going on there with singular and plural that I think a lot of gender expansive folks are familiar with when it comes to words like they and them, right? Like, we're using a pronoun that many people associate with as a plural as a singular, and Elohim is doing the exact same thing. So, weird Hebrew things. Is there anything else we wanted to say about what was going on and what she saw there? Yeah, I think why she uses that word for Samuel's ghost, we don't know. Translators have translated it essentially as a being like a god, rather than "I see a god," because that seems strange. But it's a weird thing that we don't really know why she used that word.
Yes, absolutely, Taryn. I think Taryn says, interesting that the fullness has been flattened out of the English and the cultural understanding of nothing on the same level at nothing on the same level at God, singular. And then Isaac says, love that the plural they comparison. There was a bit of discussion recently in the Discord about y'all being an inclusive term that it reminded me of.
Totally.
Yeah, and I love that. Yeah, and I agree with Taryn, just like, there is a flattening that happens. It's really interesting to see how the Hebrew people have this understanding of a very expansive spiritual world. That is really interesting.
Yeah, totally. That it was no surprise to the people of ancient ancient Israel at this point, that multiple gods existed. It was just that the one God is the most important and the most powerful and everything else, but it didn't mean that they didn't believe that other gods existed. And I think that gets forgotten a lot when we talk about that context. Well, we have to go on and read the next section of our story here, which is a very dour and upsetting prophecy. So I'll read this section here. We're going to read verses 15 through 19. So The medium has brought Samuel, the ghost of Samuel, up, and everybody's freaked out. And then Samuel says to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have summoned you to tell me what I should do." Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you just as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you today. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." Yes, very much, Taryn. The first instinct there of Samuel is, dude, just let me rest. I'm dead. Yes, good to see you, F Tempest, by the way. Good to see you. Glad you're here. Yeah, so this first instinct by Samuel is like, hey, what'd you get me out of bed for? I already told you you weren't getting the kingdom, Saul. But Saul is not really wanting to hear that. And so we get this sad prophecy where Samuel says, because you didn't do as God asked, David's going to take over as the next king. And also, you and your sons will be with me tomorrow. And as a dead person, that's not a thing you want to hear. Or that's not a thing you want to hear from a dead person, I should rather say. So yeah, a pretty upsetting thing. I wanted to touch just quickly on what Saul said, or what Samuel says about why Saul doesn't have the kingdom anymore. When Saul says, or Samuel says, got too many S's, you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Basically, Amalek and the Amalekites were people that did a bad thing, and then God told Saul to wipe them out, and Saul didn't do it. And so there's a bit of a conflict there, I think, for many people to be like, wait, God's mad at Saul for not committing genocide? What? And so this is one of those things that we struggle with when we talk about stories of that include aspects of genocide or violence against one specific group of people. And so a question that I think comes up for me is, first of all, is this just sort of like one of those instances of violence that we don't really know what to do with, and we don't know why it happened, and it upsets us, legitimately so? Or one interpretation that I've read of what Samuel says here is that God's not mad that Samuel didn't destroy the Amalekites. God's mad that Samuel didn't, or that Saul didn't listen to him. And so it's really like, you don't get the kingdom because you don't listen to me anymore, and not because you didn't destroy people. But it's complex. So I don't know. Micah, Peter, do you have any thoughts about that?
In the original story, is there a reason? I'm not familiar with it. So is there a reason given as to why Saul didn't carry out God's fierce wrath against Amalek?
It's complicated, but part of what he does is that he takes a bunch of the Amalekites' stuff, which he's not supposed to do. Like, the idea was that he was just supposed to totally decimate them, and instead he doesn't kill them all, and he takes some of their stuff as like plunder. And so that's also part of the complicated thing is God mad that Saul got like rich off of the whole thing? So it's complex. There's not a good answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like this is not
Yeah.
the only instance of a story like this where it seems like God is advocating for violence or advocating for genocide, like you said, or God is on a certain side in like a military conflict or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those passages are always hard to figure out what to do with.
Yeah, I think my instinct is to want to try to be like, to rationalize this away and say, like, that God is upset that Saul didn't follow orders, but at the same time, those orders was still the genocide of a people. Like, I don't think we can just ignore that. Like, I think that has been, at least in the Christian tradition that I was, kind of raised in, a lot of times those passages we just don't talk about because they're uncomfortable. Why do we want to go into that? And that's not the God we know. So therefore, but at the same time, like, we have to like it's there. It's part of the text that if we say the Bible, you know, especially for communities that hold the Bible to like a like with reference in certain ways, like we have to be ready to like engage with those. And it's uncomfortable. And I think for me, it just speaks of the ways that, yeah, I don't know if that was something that God would actually command, but at the same time, I know it is what was interpreted by the Hebrew people as being commanded. And so like we see that kind of use of divine violence today. So I think it's worth not ignoring and just not glossing over it, to be like, okay, divine violence, it's a, if it upsets us, we should ask why. So I think that's how, I don't have a easy answer. I think that those are just my thoughts on that.
Did you have something you wanted to say, Peter?
Oh, just I agree, and I think um, like this idea of God is even used to justify you know justify violence now, or justify things like American exceptionalism, or the idea that God is on our side, whoever us is in that context, um, and yeah, justify all kinds of atrocities by human beings.
Right. And it's complicated too, because in this story, Saul assumes that God is on his side against the Philistines, and realistically, God's not on Saul's side at all anymore. And that's part of what's so scary. So, yeah, there's no good answer for this, but I didn't want to just pretend that it didn't exist, because it's something that we have to continue to wrestle with. Yeah, I see what Isaac said there too. Absolutely, we see this today. Also see the response of, well, that's not the church or Christian community I know. Well, sure, you don't know it, but it still happened to someone. Yeah, it's true. It's important to not try to explain this stuff away. It's important to continue to wrestle with it and not just pretend that it doesn't happen. So we'll continue to talk about those examples as they come up. We're getting close to the end of our time, and we have to finish our story. So the last segment here, after Samuel's prophecy, is verses 20 through 25. Want to go back to you, Micah?
Sure. Let me grab it again. It's a challenge of having two screens. All right, 20 through 25. And immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. The woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, "Your servant has listened to you. I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you have said to me. Now, therefore, you also listen to your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you to eat. Eat that you may have the strength when you go on your way." He refused and said, "I will not eat." But his servants, together with the women, urged him, and he listened to their words. So he got up from the ground and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fatted calf in the house. She quickly slaughtered it, and she took flour, kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread, or unleavened cakes. She put them before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and they went away that night.
So here is the big moment in a weird power reversal that happens, where at first we had Saul being the one that was giving all the orders and saying, here's what's going to happen. Here's what I want you to do. And the woman being like, I don't really want to do this. And now suddenly Saul is completely laid out by this experience, and the woman responds to that. And so there's kind of a swap here. I want to bring up a sort of like part of what's going on here and what might be happening with the woman giving Saul this meal, because she does this thing where she very much downplays what she's giving. She's like, let me set a morsel before you. And then she slaughters the fatted calf and makes cake. So like she downplays it and then makes this big feast, right? And what might be going on there. And so I want to lift up a paper by a friend of mine, actually, Anna Elizabeth Marsh Higgins, who just wrote a dissertation that included this passage and talks about the importance of this scene when it comes to like food and women, and like how women use food as part of agency in the Bible. So there's like different ways we can think about this, right? There's possibly what's happening is that The woman is just trying to give Saul some food to like get him to like get up and leave. Like, okay, get your blood sugar up and get out of my house, right? So that might be what's going on. It might be part of the ritual that she does that involves summoning spirits is offering some food to the dead as part of that ritual, which is something that's common in rituals around the world to offer food to the dead. So that's maybe what's going on. Another way people have thought about it is this is essentially Saul's last appearance before he dies in battle. And maybe this is kind of her giving him his last meal. And she's seen in this case as somebody who is kind of ushering Saul out with this like final meal for him before he goes. So she ushers Samuel in and ushers Saul out as this person who can kind of move through marginal space. So all of that from the wonderful Anna Marsh Higgins paper, which will be accessible to folks much soon. Not yet, but soon. I got an early peek. So when we're thinking about what's going on here with the woman and the power swap that's happening here, I know, Peter, you found an interesting quote thinking about the change in power dynamics and what the woman says.
Yeah, I was really struck by that, by like, this woman doesn't speak very much in this passage, but that line just seems so striking of I listen to you, now you listen to me, which seems like so direct, and she's, it seems clear, from this source I was reading, that she is in some kind of marginal position in this society, and yet she somehow like, from that position on the margins speaks truth to power in this moment. And I was just really struck by that.
Yeah, totally. She really takes over as the actor in this scene because Saul goes down and suddenly she's the one that's like making everything happen. And she's the one that says who's gonna do what. And like he tries to refuse and it doesn't work. And it's kind of a weird mirroring of her earlier half refusal and then him being like, no, for real. And this time she's saying do it and he's saying no. And then she gets him to do it anyway. So there's like a strange reversal in that action. Anything you noticed there, Micah?
I love the reversal, and it's an interesting, like there's a parallel, and it's almost a chiastic structure of for people who may not know.
Yeah.
Yes, I will. A chiastic structure or a chiasm essentially is when you have two ideas that are very similarly related. In this case, would you do this for me? I know I won't do it, and then like in the middle is kind of a point that gets emphasized, and the point that gets emphasized here is Samuel's message to Saul. And so there's a very interesting kind of way that it's like an inversion of what's happening, but also what is like Saul isn't listening, and then Samuel is like Samuel's message is being emphasized by that. But I find that really interesting that oftentimes in that type of structure in literary, it's like literally the same, either the same person or like it's a parallel of a person in relative social power, I guess you could say. And this is, in a way, it elevates the woman in this moment. So I just think that's really fascinating as I was reading that.
Totally. And there's a connection to a New Testament story that you found too. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, yes. So this also comes from, and I forgot to post this earlier, I'll post this link to the article that I found this from. In the same article that I referenced earlier, Rachel Stark also points out a parallel between the woman here taking care of Saul and kind of feeding this last meal, and a woman who also comes from a quote unquote sinful past, that in Jesus's time, taking care of Jesus before Jesus is crucified. And so just to read really quickly, because I know we're right out of time. Hundreds of years after the story of the woman of Endor takes place, in Luke 7, another woman with a quote unquote sinful past will minister with the same intentional care to a king on the eve of his death, washing and kissing his feet and anointing them with oil, just as Saul and his servants do with the women of Endor. So Simon judges the woman as a sinner, but Jesus does not. And so I thought that was a really interesting like moment of foreshadow, like I guess not foreshadowing, but a parallel that those stories kind of hold together. So I just thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah, and that parallel there between women who seem to not have power, but who have this very intentional interaction with kings, and women who are seen negatively and are portrayed negatively. Yeah. So, uh, yeah, interesting parallelism, says Amory. So yeah, so that's the story of the woman of Endor, and you can decide for yourself how you want to label her and what translation makes sense as you think about this story. But I want to leave us with a couple of questions in terms of thinking about how this story relates to us as queer and trans folks, as folks who exist and sort of read these stories differently sometimes. So some thoughts that have come up for us, some questions to leave us with. How do we tend to look for religious leaders, either sanctioned ones like prophets or unsanctioned ones like this woman, to tell us what to do and who we are and what God wants from us? I think for many of us, if we have experienced people telling us that we shouldn't trust ourselves and maybe we can't even trust our relationship with God, it's a lot easier to try to go to people who we see as sources of power and say, tell me what to do, tell me what I'm supposed to be. And maybe that's not always the answer. Maybe that's something we should interrogate a little bit. So, what do we think about that question? And then the second question is, how are people pushed to the margins of religious life still important players in the larger story? This woman who had spiritual power but wasn't sanctioned by the temple, she's still important in the larger story here, and she does something for Saul that is important to him and meant something to him. So how do we claim power in situations when we can do good for others? So even though she was not an officially sanctioned religious person in this context, she was still able to do good for somebody else. And so even those of us who have experienced being pushed to the margins in our religious and faith communities might be able to have a similar experience of sort of acting in love for folks, even though we haven't got the stamp of approval from the powers that be. So those are the questions we're going to leave you all with tonight. Any last thoughts from you, Peter and Micah?
No, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, this was a fun one. Awesome. All right. Well, with that, everybody, we will leave you until next time. Our next Bible study live is happening November 16th. It's always the third Wednesday of the month. So we will see you back here in November. And until then, we hope you have a great rest of your evening. Bye, everybody.
Bye, all.